In 1497, England was nobody's idea of a superpower. While Spain and Portugal were carving up the New World with papal blessing, England was a cold, rain-soaked island on Europe's northwestern edge, recovering from decades of civil war. The Wars of the Roses had just ended, leaving the newly crowned Henry VII with a depleted treasury and a kingdom most Europeans considered a backwater. But that year, something shifted. Henry VII commissioned an Italian navigator named John Cabot to sail west and find a route to Asia's riches. Cabot reached Newfoundland, claimed it for England, and returned with tales of waters so thick with cod you could scoop them up in baskets. It wasn't gold or spices, but it was a start. For the next several decades, England watched enviously as Spanish galleons hauled Aztec gold and Incan silver across the Atlantic. The 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas had literally divided the world between Spain and Portugal, leaving England and other European powers with precisely nothing. Henry VIII, despite his 6 wives and religious upheavals, made minimal progress in challenging this duopoly. But his break from Rome in 1534 changed everything in ways nobody initially predicted. By rejecting papal authority to secure his divorce, Henry accidentally freed England from the Catholic framework that legitimized Spanish and Portuguese monopolies. If you didn't recognize the Pope's authority, you didn't have to recognize his line drawn across the globe. Elizabeth I, crowned in 1558, understood this opportunity perfectly. She inherited a kingdom that was Protestant, cash-poor, and surrounded by hostile Catholic powers. Spain, under Philip II, was the wealthiest empire on earth, its treasure fleets a floating parade of silver bars and gold coins. Elizabeth couldn't challenge Spain directly through conventional warfare. The Spanish army was legendary, their navy enormous. So she chose a different approach, state-sponsored piracy dressed up with the polite term privateering. She issued letters of marque to English sea captains, essentially licenses to rob Spanish ships and split the profits with the crown. It was brilliant economics and deniable warfare rolled into one. Francis Drake became the face of this strategy. In 1577, he embarked on a circumnavigation that was part exploration, part robbery spree. He raided Spanish ports along South America's Pacific coast, captured a treasure ship called Nuestra Señora de la Concepción with 80 pounds of gold and 26 tons of silver, and returned to England in 1580, having generated a 4,700% return on investment for his backers. Elizabeth personally took a cut that equaled an entire year of royal income. She knighted him on the deck of his ship, the Golden Hind, a gesture that infuriated Philip II, but signaled England's new attitude. We're taking what we want, and we're not apologizing. The Spanish eventually responded. Philip assembled the Spanish Armada, 130 ships carrying 30,000 men, to invade England in 1588 and crush this troublesome Protestant nation once and for all. What happened next became the founding myth of British naval power. The Spanish fleet was larger and carried more soldiers, but English ships were faster and mounted better cannons. In a week of running battles up the English Channel, English captains like Drake, John Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher harassed the Armada relentlessly. Then a crucial mistake. The Spanish anchored off Calais, and the English sent fire ships. Vessels set ablaze and sailed into the enemy fleet, scattering the Spanish formation. Storms finished the job, wrecking dozens of ships along Ireland's rocky coast. Less than half the Armada made it home. The defeat didn't destroy Spain, but it shattered the myth of Spanish invincibility. England suddenly looked like a nation that could challenge the established order. More importantly, English shipbuilders and sailors had learned they could outmaneuver larger fleets through superior tactics and ship design. The island kingdom had tasted blood in the water, and the taste was profitable. That confidence translated directly into commerce. On December 31, 1600, Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to a group of London merchants forming the East India Company. Their mission was straightforward: buy spices in Asia, sell them in Europe, make everyone rich. The Dutch already dominated the spice trade through their own East India Company, and they weren't interested in sharing. English traders arriving in the Indonesian islands, the heart of the spice-growing region, found themselves blocked, attacked, and occasionally murdered by their Dutch competitors. In 1623, Dutch forces tortured and executed 10 English traders on the island of Amboina in what became known as the Amboina Massacre. The message was clear: stay out of our territory. So the English pivoted to India. The Mughal Empire controlled the subcontinent, and unlike the fragmented island kingdoms of Indonesia, the Mughals were powerful, organized, and initially unimpressed by these pale merchants arriving on leaky ships. In 1608, Captain William Hawkins reached the court of Emperor Jahangir with a letter from James I. Jahangir found the English amusing, but barely worth his attention. The Mughal Empire's economy dwarfed England's, and its army numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Still, he granted the English permission to establish a trading post at Surat in 1613. It was a commercial concession, nothing more. The English were there to buy cotton textiles and saltpeter, pay their taxes, and stay out of Mughal politics. For decades, that's exactly what the East India Company did. They built trading posts called factories along India's coasts: Madras in 1639, Bombay acquired from Portugal in 1661, Calcutta founded in 1690. These weren't factories in the industrial sense, but fortified warehouses where goods were stored and company employees lived. The business model was simple: buy cheap in India, sell expensive in Europe. Indian cotton textiles were superior to anything produced in England, and European consumers couldn't get enough. By the 1670s, the company was importing nearly 1 million pieces of cotton cloth annually. But something was changing in the company's DNA. These merchants were operating thousands of miles from London, with communication taking 6 months each way. They started acting less like traders and more like a sovereign power. They built their own armies, recruited local soldiers called sepoys, and began minting coins. When Mughal authorities started fragmenting in the early 1700s, after Emperor Aurangzeb's death in 1707, the company saw opportunity in the chaos. Regional governors and princes started fighting each other for control, and they needed allies with money and guns. The East India Company had both. Robert Clive, a company clerk turned military commander, understood this moment perfectly. In 1757, the Nawab of Bengal, a regional ruler named Siraj-ud-Dowlah, attacked Calcutta, angry at the company's growing power and its refusal to stop fortifying its positions. Clive assembled a force of 3,000 men, mostly Indian sepoys with about 900 British soldiers, and marched to confront the Nawab's army of 50,000 at a place called Plassey on June 23, 1757. The battle was over in a few hours. The Nawab's forces collapsed not through superior British fighting, but through betrayal. Clive had bribed the Nawab's military commander, Mir Jafar, to switch sides during the battle. The casualties tell the story. Clive lost 22 soldiers. The Nawab's forces suffered around 500 deaths. Plassey wasn't the largest battle or the bloodiest, but it was the moment a trading company became a conquering power. After the battle, the company installed Mir Jafar as the puppet Nawab and extracted massive cash payments as compensation. More importantly, the company gained control over Bengal's tax collection, the Diwani rights, which meant they now governed territory and collected revenue from roughly 30 million people. A corporation was now administering a region wealthier than most European kingdoms. The line between commerce and conquest had disappeared entirely. While the company was consolidating power in India, Britain faced a more dangerous threat: France. The French had their own colonial ambitions, their own trading companies, and their own network of forts scattered across India, North America, and the Caribbean. Both nations understood that global dominance wouldn't be decided in European battlefields alone, but in these distant territories where trade routes and resources were up for grabs. The rivalry had been simmering for decades, but it exploded into open warfare in 1756 with what historians call the 7 Years' War, though Winston Churchill later called it the real First World War because fighting erupted simultaneously on 4 continents. In North America, the conflict played out as the French and Indian War. France controlled a vast arc of territory from Quebec down through the Great Lakes and along the Mississippi River to Louisiana. Britain held the 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast, hemmed in by French forts and their Native American allies. The British needed to break this containment. In 1759, General James Wolfe led an army up the St. Lawrence River to attack Quebec, the fortress city that was the key to French Canada. The French commander, Marquis de Montcalm, believed the city was unassailable. Sheer cliffs rose from the river, and his forces controlled the obvious landing points. Wolfe found a narrow path up those cliffs. On the night of September 12, 1759, British troops climbed in darkness and assembled on the Plains of Abraham, outside Quebec's walls. When dawn broke, Montcalm found an army where no army should be. He attacked immediately, a decision driven by shock rather than strategy. The battle lasted 15 minutes. British infantry held their fire until the French were 40 yards away, then delivered devastating volleys that shattered the French lines. Both Wolfe and Montcalm died from their wounds, but Quebec surrendered 5 days later. With it went France's hold on North America. The 7 Years' War ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, and the terms revealed just how decisively Britain had won. France ceded Canada and all territory east of the Mississippi River. Spain, which had allied with France late in the war, gave up Florida. France kept its Caribbean sugar islands, which they valued more highly than frozen Canadian forests, but their dreams of a North American empire were finished. Britain also consolidated control over India, pushing French influence back to a handful of coastal trading posts. In 7 years of fighting, Britain had eliminated its primary competitor from 2 continents. But victory came with a price tag. The war had cost Britain $82 million, doubling the national debt. Someone had to pay for it, and Parliament decided that someone should be the American colonists who'd benefited from French removal. The Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts of 1767, each new tax drove the wedge deeper between Britain and its wealthiest colonies. By 1776, 13 colonies declared independence, and Britain found itself fighting another expensive war, this time against its own colonists backed by France, Spain, and the Netherlands, seeking revenge. Britain lost America in 1783, but the empire's rivals had exhausted themselves helping the Americans win. France's treasury was devastated, contributing directly to the financial crisis that sparked the French Revolution in 1789. That revolution, and the subsequent rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, triggered another round of global conflict. For 22 years, from 1793 to 1815, Britain fought revolutionary and Napoleonic France in a struggle for European and global supremacy. Napoleon conquered most of Europe, but he couldn't conquer the English Channel or break British naval power. Horatio Nelson made sure of that. At the Battle of Trafalgar on October 21, 1805, Nelson commanded the British fleet against a combined French-Spanish Armada off Spain's southern coast. Nelson's tactics were unconventional. Instead of fighting in parallel lines as naval doctrine prescribed, he drove his ships perpendicular into the enemy formation, breaking it into confused segments. The British won decisively, destroying or capturing 22 enemy ships without losing a single vessel of their own. Nelson died during the battle from a French sniper's bullet, but his victory guaranteed Britain's control of the seas for the next century. Napoleon could dominate Europe's land, but he couldn't move armies or supplies across water without British permission. When the smoke cleared from the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, Britain found itself in a peculiar position. It had lost 13 prosperous American colonies, spent a fortune fighting France for 2 decades, yet somehow emerged as the world's dominant power. The Royal Navy controlled the seas without serious challenge. British merchants could ship goods anywhere. And crucially, the loss of America had taught British policymakers an unexpected lesson. Profitable colonies didn't require large settler populations of British citizens. You could extract wealth and project power through trade, military bases, and control over strategic choke points. This realization transformed how Britain built its empire. India became the laboratory for this new model. By 1818, the East India Company had defeated the Maratha Confederacy, the last major Indian power capable of challenging British control. The company now administered most of the subcontinent, either directly or through puppet princes who accepted British protection in exchange for keeping their thrones. The system was incredibly profitable. India paid for its own occupation. Taxes collected from Indian farmers funded the company's Indian army, which then conquered more territory, which generated more taxes. Britain got military power and resources without the expense of sending large armies from home. But India was just the beginning. Australia became the next piece. Captain James Cook had claimed the eastern coast for Britain in 1770, mapping a continent Europeans had barely explored. In 1788, the first fleet arrived at Botany Bay carrying 736 convicts, 17 officials, and a handful of Marines. Australia started as a prison but quickly became something more. The interior held vast grazing lands perfect for sheep, and by the 1820s, Australian wool was supplanting Indian cotton in British textile mills. Free settlers followed the convicts, pushing into the interior and displacing Aboriginal populations who'd lived there for 65,000 years. Britain claimed the entire continent in 1829, though they'd barely explored half of it. New Zealand followed a similar pattern. British missionaries and traders arrived in the 1810s, drawn by timber, flax, and whaling stations. The Treaty of Waitangi in 1840 theoretically protected Maori land rights while establishing British sovereignty, but the agreement's English and Maori versions said different things, a misunderstanding that led to decades of land confiscation and warfare. By 1850, British settlers were arriving by the thousands, and New Zealand was firmly in the empire's grasp. Africa presented a different challenge. The continent's interior remained unmapped by Europeans, its diseases lethal to outsiders, its kingdoms powerful enough to resist casual invasion. For decades, Britain's African presence consisted mainly of coastal trading posts and Cape Colony at the southern tip, seized from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars in 1806. Cape Colony controlled the sea route to India, which made it strategically invaluable. But Britain wasn't conquering Africa's interior yet. That would wait another generation. Instead, British attention turned to a moral campaign that paradoxically expanded imperial influence, abolishing the slave trade. Parliament outlawed the trade in 1807, then spent decades pressuring other nations to follow. The Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron patrolled the Atlantic, intercepting slave ships and freeing their human cargo. Between 1808 and 1860, the squadron captured 1,600 ships and freed 150,000 enslaved Africans. This required a network of naval bases along Africa's coast, which required treaties with local rulers, which gradually extended British influence inland. Morality and empire expanded together. The East India Company's conquest machine kept rolling. They took Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, from the Dutch in 1815. They seized Singapore from a Malay sultan in 1819, creating a naval base that controlled the straits between the Indian Ocean and South China Sea. They fought 3 wars in Burma between 1824 and 1885, each one grabbing another piece of territory until the entire kingdom was absorbed. They occupied Aden in 1839 to control access to the Red Sea. Every strategic harbor, every trade route, every geographical bottleneck, Britain was methodically locking them down. Then came the technology that changed everything: steam engines, railways, telegraphs, and machine guns. The Industrial Revolution that began in Britain's textile mills in the late 1700s reached maturity in the mid-1800s, and it handed the British Empire tools of conquest that previous empires couldn't imagine. A steam-powered gunboat could navigate rivers deep into continents, ignoring wind and current. A railway could move troops and supplies hundreds of miles in days rather than months. A telegraph could transmit orders from London to Bombay in hours. And a Maxim gun could fire 600 rounds per minute, mowing down charging warriors armed with spears and outdated muskets. The technology gap between industrialized and non-industrialized societies had never been wider, and Britain exploited it ruthlessly. The Suez Canal exemplifies how infrastructure became empire. French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps completed the canal in 1869, cutting a 120-mile channel through Egyptian desert to connect the Mediterranean and Red Seas. Before Suez, ships traveling from London to Bombay had to sail around Africa's entire coast, a 10,500-mile journey taking months. The canal reduced that to 6,200 miles and cut weeks off the voyage. Britain initially opposed the project because France was building it, but once completed, British ships were its heaviest users. When Egypt's ruler, Khedive Ismail, went bankrupt from the canal's construction costs, British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli saw an opportunity. In 1875, he purchased Egypt's 44% stake in the canal for $4 million, giving Britain effective control over the shortcut to India. But owning canal shares wasn't enough. In 1882, after Egyptian nationalists rebelled against foreign financial control, Britain invaded and occupied Egypt. The occupation was supposed to be temporary. British officials repeatedly promised to leave once stability returned. They were still there in 1914, and Egypt had become a British protectorate in everything but name. Controlling Egypt meant controlling the canal, and controlling the canal meant controlling the fastest route to half the empire. Railways proved equally transformative. In India, the British laid 25,000 miles of track between 1853 and 1900. The official justification was economic development, and railways did boost trade. But the network's design revealed its true purpose. Lines radiated from port cities like Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras toward the interior, perfect for extracting raw materials, but terrible for connecting Indian cities to each other. More importantly, railways could rapidly deploy troops to crush rebellions. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, when sepoys mutinied and much of northern India erupted in violence against company rule, the British government dissolved the East India Company and assumed direct control. The Crown needed to prevent another uprising, and railways became the nervous system of control. Africa was next, and the conquest happened with breathtaking speed. In 1870, European powers controlled roughly 10% of Africa's territory. By 1914, they controlled 90%. The scramble began in earnest when King Leopold II of Belgium started claiming the Congo Basin in the late 1870s, hiring explorer Henry Morton Stanley to secure treaties with local chiefs. Other European powers panicked that Belgium would grab the best territory. German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck convened the Berlin Conference in 1884, gathering representatives from 14 nations to carve up Africa on paper. No African leaders were invited to this meeting where their lands were divided. Britain grabbed the largest share, but it required wars to make the map match reality. In southern Africa, the discovery of diamonds near Kimberley in 1867 and gold on the Witwatersrand in 1886 attracted prospectors, speculators, and empire builders like Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes made his fortune in diamonds, became Prime Minister of Cape Colony, and dreamed of a continuous British corridor from Cape Town to Cairo. That dream required defeating the Boer republics, Afrikaner states in the interior, and the Zulu kingdom. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 saw initial British disasters at Isandlwana, where 20,000 Zulu warriors overwhelmed 1,800 British troops, but superior firepower eventually prevailed. The Boer Wars that followed proved more difficult. Between 1899 and 1902, Britain deployed 450,000 troops to defeat 88,000 Boer fighters, farmers turned guerrilla warriors who knew the terrain and used hit-and-run tactics that frustrated conventional British forces. Britain eventually won by burning Boer farms and herding civilians into concentration camps, where 26,000 women and children died from disease and malnutrition. The tactics worked, but stained Britain's reputation. Still, by 1902, Britain controlled southern Africa from Cape Town to Rhodesia, and Rhodes's dream of red-painted British territory stretching northward was taking shape. West Africa fell through a combination of conquest and negotiation. The Royal Niger Company operated like the East India Company had in India, trading goods while gradually assuming governmental functions. In 1900, the British government revoked the company's charter and assumed direct rule over what became Nigeria. Similar patterns played out in the Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, and Gambia. East Africa saw British forces pushing inland from the coast to secure Uganda and the headwaters of the Nile, water sources that ultimately fed into Egypt and the Suez Canal. Every piece connected to another piece in an interlocking system of strategic control. By 1900, Queen Victoria's empire was staggering in scale. Maps in British schoolrooms showed roughly 1/4 of the world's landmass painted red or pink. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," wasn't mere propaganda, it was geographical fact. When the sun set on London, it rose over Melbourne. When it set over Melbourne, it rose over Vancouver. At any given moment somewhere in the empire, it was daylight and the Union Jack was flying. But the empire hadn't reached its maximum extent yet. World War I delivered the final expansion. When war erupted in August 1914, Britain's allies and dominions joined automatically or by choice. Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, and South African troops fought in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Over 1.4 million Indian soldiers served, the largest volunteer force in history. They fought in Mesopotamia, Egypt, France, and East Africa. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Newfoundland contributed another 1.3 million troops. The war demonstrated that Britain could draw on a global pool of manpower and resources that no European rival could match. Victory in 1918 brought one final round of territorial acquisition. The defeated German Empire had colonies in Africa and the Pacific. The Ottoman Empire, Germany's ally, collapsed entirely. The League of Nations created mandates, territories supposedly being prepared for eventual independence, but administered by victorious powers in the meantime. Britain acquired former German colonies in East Africa, which became Tanganyika. In the Middle East, Britain took mandates over Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. They gained control over former German Pacific islands north of the equator. Each mandate added more red to the map. By 1920, the British Empire reached its territorial zenith. It covered 1371 million square miles, roughly 24% of Earth's land surface. It governed 458 million people, about 1/4 of humanity. It spanned every inhabited continent and every time zone. It included industrial economies like Canada and Australia, agricultural regions like India and Sudan, strategic bases like Gibraltar and Malta, tiny islands like Ascension and Tristan da Cunha that served as naval coaling stations, and vast stretches of desert, jungle, and Arctic tundra whose main value was simply being painted red on the map. The administrative structure was bewilderingly complex. Some territories were crown colonies ruled directly by governors appointed from London. Others were dominions with their own parliaments and prime ministers, but owing allegiance to the British crown. India was an empire unto itself, with the king-emperor ruling through a viceroy. Protectorates acknowledged British authority over foreign policy while maintaining local rulers. Mandates were temporary trusts meant to end eventually, and scattered throughout were chartered company territories, naval bases, and strategic outposts that defied easy categorization. The empire that took 3 centuries to build unraveled in 3 generations. The warning signs appeared immediately after World War I. Britain had won the war, but at catastrophic cost. Over 880,000 British soldiers dead, the national debt quadrupled, and an economy that had spent 4 years converting factories to weapons production. The war had been financed partly by borrowing from the United States, and suddenly Britain was a debtor nation to its former colony. The global financial center was shifting from London to New York, and with it went the economic foundation that had funded imperial expansion. More dangerous than debt was the change in how colonized peoples viewed their rulers. Millions of colonial soldiers had fought for the empire, seen Europeans killing each other with industrial efficiency, and returned home questioning why they should accept foreign domination. In India, Mohandas Gandhi launched his non-cooperation movement in 1920, turning passive resistance into mass protest. The 1919 Amritsar massacre, where British troops fired into an unarmed crowd killing 379 people, had destroyed any pretense that British rule was benevolent. Indian nationalism wasn't new, but it was now organized, popular, and impossible to ignore. Egypt gained nominal independence in 1922, though Britain kept troops there and controlled the Suez Canal. Iraq became independent in 1932, though British influence remained strong. These weren't full withdrawals, but they established a pattern. Britain was slowly retreating while trying to maintain influence through treaties and military bases. The old model of direct rule was becoming too expensive and too politically toxic. World War II finished what World War I had started. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain again declared war, and again the empire mobilized. Over 2.5 million Indian troops served, along with hundreds of thousands from Africa, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia. But this war was different. Japan conquered British possessions across Asia, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, shattering the myth of European invincibility. In February 1942, Singapore, the fortress Britain had spent 2 decades fortifying, surrendered to a smaller Japanese force after just a week of fighting. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. The myth that European powers were inherently superior and militarily unbeatable died in Singapore's fall. When the war ended in 1945, Britain was economically devastated. The country was bankrupt, its cities bombed, its people exhausted, and its global position undermined by 2 new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, who both opposed old-style colonialism for their own reasons. Britain could barely feed its own population and had to implement bread rationing in 1946, something not even required during the war. Maintaining an empire required resources Britain no longer possessed. India forced the issue. Nationalist movements had grown too powerful to suppress. Without massive military force, Britain couldn't afford. In August 1947, Britain partitioned the subcontinent into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan, ending 190 years of British rule. The partition triggered horrific communal violence. Estimates suggest between 1 and 2 million people died in the mass migrations and religious killings that followed. Britain's exit was rushed and chaotic, but it was final. The jewel in the imperial crown was gone. The loss of India created a domino effect. If Britain couldn't hold India, What was the point of holding everything else? Palestine became independent Israel in 1948, though Britain's hasty exit left a conflict that continues today. Ceylon and Burma gained independence in 1948. Malaya achieved independence in 1957 after Britain defeated a communist insurgency. The Gold Coast became independent Ghana in 1957, the first sub-Saharan African colony to break free. Nigeria followed in 1960. Then came the Suez Crisis of 1956, the moment Britain learned it was no longer a superpower. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France invaded to seize it back. The United States, furious at not being consulted, threatened economic retaliation. The Soviet Union threatened military intervention. Britain was forced to withdraw in humiliation. The message was clear. Britain could no longer take unilateral military action without American approval. The 1960s saw the floodgates open. 17 African territories gained independence between 1960 and 1968. Cyprus in 1960, Tanzania in 1961, Uganda in 1962, Kenya in 1963, after Britain had brutally suppressed the Mau Mau Rebellion, Zambia in 1964. Rhodesia unilaterally declared independence in 1965 under white minority rule, which Britain opposed but couldn't prevent. The empire was dissolving faster than anyone had predicted. The final significant piece fell on July 1, 1997, when Britain handed Hong Kong back to China. The 99-year lease on the new territories expired, and unlike 1842, Britain had no leverage to negotiate a renewal. Prince Charles attended the handover ceremony as rain poured down. The Union Jack was lowered at midnight, and with it went the last major territory of an empire that once covered a quarter of the earth. What remained were 14 small territories, places like Gibraltar, the Falklands, and scattered islands most people couldn't locate on a map. The British Empire, the largest in human history, had ended not with conquest or catastrophic defeat, but with a gradual, inevitable deflation as the forces that had built it, naval supremacy, industrial advantage, divided rivals, and ruthless determination, all faded into history.